Michelle, it's been just over 2 weeks as we're recording this since we wrapped up our first ever Disney Vacation Club member cruise. And I want to take you back even farther than that, though, however.
Okay.
Just slightly over a year ago, almost a year ago to this day, we were blessed to have Didier Ghez, Ted Thomas, and J.B. Kaufman on the show to talk about the monograph they co-authored, Walt Disney and El Grupo in Latin America. That's episode 322 of the show, by the way, if you want to go back and listen to that. Flash forward back to that cruise I was just talking about, and who do we find speaking on board? Well, it's Didier and Ted, which we were so excited about. We approached them and reintroduced ourselves, and they couldn't have been nicer. And when we were speaking with them, Didier happened to mention about, he talked a little bit about another monograph he has working on, focusing on Walt Disney's true life adventures. And we told him, we love that series. Yes. Would he be willing to come back on the show and talk about it, which he kindly agreed to, which was super exciting because, before Walt Disney built the theme parks and, well before many of the nature documentaries you love, well, Walt and so many of his creative people took audiences across the globe with films like Seal Island, The Living Desert. They won multiple Academy Awards, influenced public understanding of nature, inspired generations. Think Jacques Cousteau, think Wild Kingdom, think the Disney nature films, etc. But how did those films come to be? Well, that's exactly what's discussed in The Origins of Walt Disney's True Life Adventures, written by today's guest and released through the Hyperion Historical Alliance. He is Didier Ghez, and just to remind you of his outstanding resume, he's an author, historian. He edits the Walt's People series of interviews with historical figures associated with Disney. He's also authored the multi-volume series, They Drew as They Pleased, featuring some of the Disney Studios concept artists through the years. He's worked on so many other outstanding projects, and now he's back. Didier Ghez back on the Hyperion Adventures podcast. Welcome back to the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Tom, and thank you for having me, Tom and Michelle. It's really a delight.
Well, we're very excited and thrilled. We're really looking forward to getting from the author some highlights, some perspectives of this book. We had this book already, and it's an autographed one, but love it. Just love. It's one of those books that you can really enjoy in so many ways, but it really helps take you somewhere. And we're excited to be able to share that with our listeners.
Well, I'm so glad. By the way, my internet connection seems to be a little bit unstable, so I hope you will be able to hear me all right. But
right now you're coming in loud and clear. Yeah. That's great.
So I guess our first question is, what really drew you personally to this subject?
Well, it's really interesting. It's a combination of factors. So when I was researching They Drew as They Pleased, I was looking at a lot of artwork at the Animation Research Library, where all of the artwork from past Disney movies is stored. And I was looking at a lot of unproduced shorts and features and looking at all of that artwork. And while looking at all of that, the person who was helping me and myself stumbled upon a lot of story sketches from projects that we couldn't really place, and they were like really mysterious and with lots of bees and lots of things about Egypt and some things about like completely unrelated stuff, and in a style that was often very interesting, and we just couldn't understand what those were, and there was really no clue there, and so that really intrigued me. I was like, oh, I like all of those unproduced projects. I would love to know more about them. And then in parallel to that, I'm always searching collections, libraries, special collections at universities and so on and so forth to find out if they have documents related to Disney. And I stumbled upon a massive collection of documents from an artist who was mostly a children illustrator, an illustrator of children books, but who had also worked for Disney as a concept artist and a story artist. And his name is Clancy Holling. And I found that amazing collection of written documentation of projects that he had worked on for Disney, which I knew nothing about. And a lot of them were related to the true life adventures. And I was like, huh, this is fun, this is interesting. And there were quite a few story sketches and so on and so forth. But that was the second sort of clue, second element that fell in place, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And then the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle was at some point my friend, the late and fellow Disney historian, the late Jim Korkis, contacted me and said, Didier, I've been contacted by a small historical society called uh, and now obviously the name escapes me, but a small historical society who says that they have a lot of documents related to the cinematographer couple El and Alma Milot, who were the cinematographers who worked on the first true life adventure, Seal Island, and the first of the People and Places series, the Alaskan Eskimo. And they don't really know, the Historical Society was the Great Bonny Lake Society. And they said they don't really know what to do with those documents, and they would like to talk to a Disney historian. And I thought maybe you would be interested in talking to them. I'm like, yeah, of course I am. Absolutely. So I spoke with them and they said, yeah, we have like um, part of the diaries of the Milots. We have lots of photographs. We have a few autobiographical notes and things like that. And so they sent copies of all of that to me. And then I kept digging and I would find more and more and more there. And I was like, this is interesting. Between the documents from Holding Sea Holding about those lost true life adventures, which actually, by the way, shed some lights on the drawings that I'd seen at the Animation Research Library, and those documents from the Milots, I'm starting to think that there might be a book project in all of that, because book projects can start in one of two ways. Either you have a subject matter that you're really passionate about and you start digging and digging and digging. And that's one way. That's the traditional way of starting. But there's another way, which is you start finding a huge cache of documents about things you didn't know anything about. And then you realize, whoa, there's an amazing story here. We need to tell that story. And so that's what happened for the origins of Walt Disney's True Life Adventures.
So I find it fascinating that, yeah, I mean, obviously this focuses on the true life adventures, but really it focuses on even many years before that, where this kind of started to take place, like the book's title, The Origins of the True Life Adventures. And this goes back to one of Disney's animated classics as well. I noticed that in the book that this is kind of where the groundwork was first laid for these true life adventures, right, Didier? Didier?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. So when I started working on that project after having found all of those documents, the first thing I did was ask myself a lot of questions, and the questions were basically why? Why did Walt start working on the True Life Adventures? And how? How did it all get started? What are the roots of the idea? Where is the origin of all of that? Because the story we had heard told many times, which was a story released in the Reader's Digest, was that Walt at some point goes to Alaska, meets Al Milot, and tells him, "Go film for me in Alaska." And Al Milot says, "What do you want me to film?" And he says, "Well, you know." And Al is like, "No, I don't really." And he says, "Well, you just film." And then when I started filming, I sent all of that footage to Walt, and he said, "More seals. Focus on the seals, not on the human beings." And that was a really fantastic tall tale. It was a great story, but it was just made up for the press. And I started realizing that the story was much richer, much more interesting. And so the first thing was, where does this all come from? Where did they start thinking about sending cinematographers or photographers to another place to document that place and to send information to the studio? And what I realized by digging deeper was it started with Bambi. And there, Walt had an artist on his staff called Jake Day, and Day was from Maine and was a great photographer, and Walt knew all of that. And when he was starting to work on Bambi, Walt realized that his artist needed reference material to create the backgrounds, to create the mood, to create all of that. And so he sends Jake Day to Maine, where Jake is from, to the forest of Maine to take pictures both during the spring and the winter of what he sees there as reference material for the artist working on Bambi. And the great thing is that Jake travels with a friend of his who doesn't work for the studio, and that friend is a person called Lester Hall. And when I started researching that trip, I realized, oh wow! First, I didn't know that there were two of them traveling to Maine, and then I discovered their correspondence with the studio, which was really fascinating because you could see a parallel between that correspondence and then the correspondence from the Milots, basically a few years later. And you could see that the way of working was the same. The people they were talking to at the studio were roughly the same, and so on and so forth. I'm like, this is interesting. There are so many parallels with the True Life Adventures. And then obviously the big aha moment is that I realized that while Jack Day had not really written much about his trip to Maine, his friend Lester Hall had kept a diary of that trip, and that diary had actually been released by his family in a very confidential publication, which I managed to get a hold of. And so then I started having a story which was really worth telling, and that really came to life, where you could see it from their perspective, their eyes, and you could take that time machine and go back there with them and travel with them to Maine in the 1930s to really see what they had seen and experience what they had experienced during the making of Bambi. And so that was the first. That was the first element, the first root of really what became the True Life Adventures. But then I was like, okay, but then what happens? Then what happens between that Bambi 1930s, late 1930s, and then 1946 when Walt sends his team to Alaska, sends Al and El Mamilot to Alaska, and of course in the middle there is World War II. And what happens in World War II, which is in itself an incredibly fascinating story, is that Walt starts using the animation medium as a way to teach. First, to teach members of the Army and the Navy and so on and so forth on a commission from the government. But then he realizes, okay, if I can do that with people who are in the Army and the Navy and so on and so forth, I can also do that with the more general audience. I can teach to kids in schools. I can teach to people who are just interested in learning and so on and so forth. And maybe I can use all of my new techniques to do new things, things that the studio hasn't done before, to just diversify. And the story of what all of the projects he worked on, those educational projects, was one which had not been told really before. And so I started thinking, okay, what can I find about all of those teaching projects? What were they? Are there interesting illustrations? Is there artwork that is worth reproducing? Is there correspondence? And so I started digging into the most diverse sources of material, both at the Disney Archives and outside of the Disney Archives. And you had, for example, the finance minister in the U.S., the Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau, who kept diaries during that whole period. And in quite a few of his diaries, you have mentions of Walt and meeting with Walt and interaction with the studio and so on and so forth. I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's especially interesting because it's so detailed that I can get the exact timeline. I can get it from his perspective. I can really tell the story in a much, much richer way than it had been told before. And then it built from there.
You know, as you're telling this and having seen a lot of details in the book, I mean, you are bringing the reader right into, as they say, the room where it happened. You're laying out all of this history behind it. Like when you mention other storyboards and everything. Those are in the book, and they're fascinating to go along, paralleling with your description of just how this started to unfold. Because it wasn't one of those stories where, like you said, it was unique that it kind of had a root in Bambi, but it wasn't where somebody went and pitched to Walt, hey, let's do this. And no, it really unfolded. And you do that so well in the book. You really develop that. And you share so many fun stories, like when you're talking about Al and Elma Milot, and it's funny. You even go to the detail of showing how Walt reached out to them because of a connection. Somebody said, "Hey, they would be good," and then you found out that actually they had first approached Walt years before about an Alaskan project, and so there's so many of these wonderful behind the scenes stories. And I'm wondering, as a researcher, um, what did you find is the most fascinating of these to uncover?
Well, I'll tell you both about some of the documents and some of the stories. So from a document perspective, if I now focus purely on the first of the true life adventures and that trip to Alaska in 1946 by Al and Elma Milot, and you have to realize, I mean, Alaska in 1946, it's not yet even a state. It's there is I mean no real infrastructure there. It's just starting to become what we know today, and so they are really and they go to really remote areas of Alaska and so on and so forth. It's a really tough trip, and so I started working with the Great Bonny Lake Society, as I said, and I found quite a few documents there. But I could see that there were missing pieces. I could see that they had part of the story, but not the full story, and that they had some photographs, really great ones, and quite a few of them appear in the book. But not, I could feel that there was more to find, more story to tell, more documents to unearth. So I started contacting a few museums in Alaska whom I knew had documents related to the Milots, and especially one of them, I think it was a museum in Juneau, if I'm not mistaken. Um, I contacted them just to basically get access to more photographs. And they said, oh, yeah, we have quite a few photos and we're happy to share scans with you and so on and so forth. Yeah, absolutely. We're glad to do that. They're like, but oh, by the way, have you been in touch with, I think it was the granddaughter of the Milots or a niece? And so I got in touch with the niece, and the niece said, oh, yeah, I have quite a few documents. And she shared those with me. And she said, by the way, do you know that my uncle and his wife had written an autobiography. And I'm like, an autobiography? This is great. This is fantastic. I say, but do you have the autobiography? She says, I have a few pages of it, but we never found the autobiography itself. And so she shares a few pages with me. And it's really fascinating because it's all about their adventure in Alaska during that whole year. And but it's just like one page here, one page there, like page 10, page 200, page whatever. And I'm like, oh, this is so frustrating. It's just so many pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are missing. And so, and in parallel, I was still in touch with that museum in Juneau, and he sends me the photographs that I had requested. And he says, oh, by the way, I also have a manuscript here by the Milots. Would you be interested in copies of that? And I'm like, the manuscript? What manuscript? Tell me more. And he's like, well, it seems to be an autobiography talking about their trips to Alaska. And basically, they had the only known copy of that full manuscript. And so he sent me the full book, basically. And obviously, between all of the diaries that I had collected from their trip to Alaska, their correspondence at the Disney Archives, and now that whole manuscript, you could tell the complete story in an amount of detail that's just uncanny. And then obviously the role of the historian is to select the most interesting anecdotes, the most interesting stories, the best quotes, and the best photographs, and then taking the reader there with the Milots to really experience what they had experienced there during that whole year in Alaska. And so that's always what I try to do. I try to take the reader not just with me, but really with the artists, with the cinematographers, with the people who were there to really allow them to tell their story to the reader and to show them what they have seen and to let them experience what is really interesting to see and to experience.
Well, that's one of the things I love about this monograph, this book, is the way you wrote it, in that you're using their words. You're not just writing about them. Yes, you are, but you're using their words to tell the story. And I find that a fascinating way, and truly a way to bring you into the story, as you're kind of mentioning. Excuse me. And I feel like also you were talking about, the dangers of Alaska during that time, and how it's not like, yes, we go on cruises over Alaska now, and yeah, it's all nice and everything, and sure, it is very rustic, but it still is a little bit more tamed. Not during those periods. As a matter of fact, there were some moments of real danger for the Malots during that story. Could you? I know that there was one that in particular that you brought up in this monograph involving some caribou. Is that right, Didier?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Elma is getting way too close to some of the caribous, and she doesn't realize the danger. She doesn't realize what's going on, and she basically almost gets killed by the caribous at some point. And it's just it's a very very close call. But the reality is that they are experiencing real difficulties in that region. I mean, I'll just mention three. One, obviously, when they arrive, Al has difficulty even operating his camera. It's so cold that the camera itself doesn't really work properly, and then he finds solutions for that. Another one is, I mean, the best moment when I was reading the diaries of Elma Milot was when when they're back, they just traveled back to, I think, Juneau, and when she arrives in Juneau, her entry in the diary is first bath in 2 months. And it's like, oh my. And then the other one is that Walt also goes at some point to Alaska the year after the Milot are there, and he goes with one of his daughters, with Sharon, actually. And they almost suffer a catastrophic plane accident. They almost die basically on that trip. I mean, it's yeah, it was really touch and go at some point during that trip. They encounter a storm, and they are in a plane that's obviously not pressurized at the time, and so on and so forth. And they almost go down. So that was quite scary also, to rediscover that. I knew that, but I rediscovered that during the research, and it was like, oh wow. Uh, but then you have like other moments during the research that are more fun, less scary. I mean, it's not all the whole book is not just about the trip of the Milots to Alaska. It's also about some of the Donald Duck projects from the 1940s, educational project, and you see a lot of artwork from that. It's also about the history of music, a project on which a wonderful artist called Sylvia Holland worked quite a bit. And I'd already discussed that project a little bit in Did As They Pleased, but I had a chance to go in even more depth in this volume, and there is so much more to be told that I hope I'll tell that story in another volume later on. It's about a project about electronics with new characters that the studio was developing at the time, and with Donald also interacting with those characters. It's about so much more than just Alaska, and also obviously about all of those unproduced True Life adventures, because that was also fun to unravel that package to find out, okay, but what else were they working on? What else? What were the routes that you traveled that didn't necessarily lead to a finished movie or series or episode of the series. So that was really fun.
Well, and like you said, there was so many other things going on, and you brought up World War II, and I believe it was like Walt and Roy realizing they kind of have to reinvent what the studio is after the war, right?
Without a doubt, because the war is obviously a time of terrible hardship for obviously people all around the world. But at the studio, it also means that from a financial standpoint, it's very very tough. The type of movies they were producing before the war, some were incredibly successful: Snow White, Dumbo. Some less so. Fantasia, Bambi did not meet with tremendous success. Pinocchio, half-half. And so the studio is not in great shape when it enters World War II, and it's really important for them to get all of that work from the government and from the different parts of the army and so on and so forth. And and they know that they're going to have to rebuild. Walt and Roy know that they're going to have to rebuild things after the war, and they don't really know what that's going to mean. And so they're both thinking about different ways of diversifying what the studio does, and be it with some live action productions or live action combination of live action and animation, or trying to conquer that educational market which is starting to exist, or trying to do new things, just new things. They're just trying and throwing lots of spaghettis at the wall and trying to see what sticks. And so one of the ideas is precisely to go more deeper into that educational area, and they don't really know how to do that. Is it going to be for schools and the lecture circuit? Is it going to be maybe even for the new medium of television, which they're starting to think very seriously in 1943, and that's why that electronics project, for example, is originally conceived, is potentially to go on TV, or is it going to be cinemas with some form of shorter movies that could work combined with the longer movies that and so that's what ends up happening with the true life adventures, which end up being combined with longer movies in the programs of the cinemas. But obviously the cinemas at the time were a bit reluctant to accept that, and then they realized that they were very successful, and then they obviously come on board. But so it's a really interesting time at the studio. They are producing those package features that are very non-traditional. Animated features, and so lots of experimentations, and that's how the true life adventures get started. I'll add just one last thing, which is when Walt sends the Milots to Alaska in 1946. He doesn't really know what he's going to do with what they bring back in terms of footage, and it takes a really long time for him to figure it out. There's a lot of experimentation. There is a lot of tweaking and a lot of trial and error and so on and so forth, until finally, more than a year after they come back from Alaska, he's like, oh, I know what I want to do. I want to focus on the seals, and I want to make a movie which is just about that island where the seals are, and that becomes Seal Island. But that realization happens again more than a year, I think, after the Milots come back, and just less than 6 months before the movie is actually released in cinemas, which is like, when I realized that, when I looked at the timing, I'm like, that can't be right. Oh my, that's amazing. It takes so long. It just and they try so many different things before getting to that conclusion. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is, and it comes across very much in this monograph for sure. And I don't, I know the focus is not completely on Alaska and the Malots, but I can't leave it before we talk about one other thing that happened that you discuss in the book, and that is that they came across a group of indigenous people from Alaska, and apparently they were able to experience something that had not been experienced in a long time. That they had some technical challenges with, but was truly a fascinating part of this book and their research. Could you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. I mean, that was really a great moment when I stumbled upon those entries in their diaries and in their autobiography, which is that when they arrive in Alaska, they really would like to experience a tradition that they know has been alive for many years, but which hasn't, for the reason I'm going to explain, hasn't happened in a while, which is the mask dance. And the mask dance is again this very traditional ceremony of the indigenous people from that region. And the problem is the priests who have come to on a mission to that region have forbidden the indigenous people to practice the mask dance. They see it as obviously a heathen tradition, and they are very opposed to that. Well, when the Milots go there, the indigenous people decide that they want to share with them what the mask dance feels like. And the priest who's there gives his reluctant but exceptional authorization for the mask dance to happen. And so the Milots actually experienced two mask dance at the time. It's very difficult for them to film it, but they managed to do so because the light issue is a huge problem, and but they actually managed to do that. And then after the dance has happened, which they're obviously blown away by that whole ceremony. After the dance happens, they find in trash pile, they file all of the masks, and they ask the indigenous people. They ask them. They say, "Well, what are you going to do with those masks? Are you really throwing them away?" And they say, "Yeah. I mean, that's the after the dance, we throw them away." And they're like, "Would you allow us to buy them?" And they say, "Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's fine. We'll be happy to sell those to you." And so they buy all of the masks, and then those masks stay at their place for quite a few years after that. And then they actually donated the mask to a museum in Alaska, where they can still be found to this day. So if you ever go on a cruise to Alaska,
Yeah,
you
I'll
need
have
to
to
go and see those masks,
look.
which
It-
I hope one day I'll be able to go on that cruise and show it to like Disney Vacation Club members and show
Oh,
them the mask
Ah,
and
yes,
so on and so forth.
yes. I
We'll
like
see.
your thinking.
Mhm.
Got to make that happen. I know
Mhm.
it's interesting how you're talking of Walt's realizing he's got to have a story to tell and kind of struggling with what that story is until he decides the seals. And I think I noticed that you kind of are the storyteller here of that history of, like you're saying, from Bambi all the way through. And I love how you really weave personal experiences along with like the actual history. Um, as a storyteller, how did you approach that?
Well, it's really funny. I had a good friend of mine who was working on her first book, and when I read the first version of her book, I was like, you know, this is really great in terms of research. I absolutely love it, but it's too dry. I can't actually read this properly. And she had just sent me the first few pages, and it was really her first effort. So she was really looking forward to getting some feedback. And I'm like, this is great, but it's too dry. And I'm like, let me try and 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 think about the way I do it and share with you sort of my philosophy for doing that. And I came up with that image, which is when you write something about Disney or when you write about history, uh, you should do this. For every two paragraphs of chocolate, you can have one paragraph of broccoli. And she's like, I'm not sure what you mean. And I'm like, very simple. I say, your chocolate is your great quotes, it's the fun facts. That's the chocolate. And then the broccoli is to tell the story and to ground it, you need some very precise dates. You need to mention some context, some historical context, some and that's a bit dry. But as long as there is chocolate before it and chocolate after it, the readers will absorb it without too much problem, and they'll eat their broccoli to get to the chocolate. And she said, "That's interesting. Let me look at your books." And then she reread some of my books, and she says, "Oh, I see exactly how you do this. This is really fun. I can do that." And then she sent me the new version of her manuscript, and her new version, the new version of her manuscript, which was great. It read really fluently because she had started with some chocolate, which was a great quote at the beginning, or a great anecdote at the beginning, which drew the reader in, and then she could intersperse the very precise facts that were absolutely needed, but which in themselves are not really fun, but which in the context of all of the quotes and the great stories become actually very nice to have, and allow the reader to really understand where he or she is and what things are happening around those facts.
Definitely.
Yeah, I love that concept, and I
Yes.
really believe that that is exactly what you're getting in this monograph, where you're getting, yes, you're getting the juicy details wrapped around some very what could be dry facts, but because there's so many juicy parts to it, some well placed stories and everything, it really comes across that you're getting both aspects of it. And so I'm curious, you've already brought up a ton of things and we may have already used them up, but I believe you do such extraneous research that during it, you probably found some other items that maybe made you go, whoa, or wow, or it's kind of just stopped you in your tracks. Is there a couple things we haven't brought up yet that really surprised you or really you found of interest during your research?
I think overall, what was really interesting is that I kept finding more and more and more and more. And yeah, at some point, the fun part is when I was concluding the research, I ended up finding that quote from Walt, who from I think like 4 years after the release of Seal Island, where Walt says to the press, he says, "We're working at the moment on, I think, like 4 or 5 parallel educational series, one about nature, one about people and places, but also one about music, one about history, and one about economics." And I'm like, huh, that's interesting. I wonder where those other ideas, the ones about history, music, and economics went. And so economics, that did not go very far, but the other two, history, he was actually thinking of starting that with Ben and Me, the short that was actually released, and then carrying on with more shorts about history or about folklore, American folklore. I was like, huh. And then music, he starts with obviously adventures in music, and that's why it's called Adventures in Music, because it's he's thinking about in parallel to adventures in nature, which are the true life adventures, and adventures in basically geography or people and places. He would have a parallel series called Adventures in Music, and so you have Adventures in Music Melody, which is the first one, and then it's followed by what frankly would have been Adventures in Music, Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom, which is the second one. And he was thinking of having more than that, and there were concepts that were already worked on at the time that didn't actually make it to the screen. And I thought, huh, I wonder if I can find more about this. And so one of the books that I have actually written that will be released in a few years is one which is called Walt Disney's Adventures in Music, History, and Nature, which is sort of the sequel to the origins of Walt Disney's True Life Adventures, and which covers subjects that are not directly, well, some are directly connected to the True Life Adventures, but some are about those parallel series that would have existed and that actually didn't make it to the screen or only partially made it to the screen. So that was a fun additional discovery at the end of that project.
Nice, nice. Obviously, doing a work like this is, something very personal and emotional. And I was wondering, how did you feel differently after you completed the work, or what did you take from this experience?
Well, there are a few things. The first one, obviously, is I rewatched the True Life Adventures and realized how really revolutionary they were for that time period. And also, I started realizing how much more work went in the making of them than what I originally thought, and how many incredible stories. They were to tell about each one of them and the making of each one of them and how little we really know about them. I mean, I started researching, obviously, after that, also the making of White Wilderness, for example, where another couple, Chris, oh, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on their names, but Chris Hibbler and his wife worked on, and this is another Lois and Chris Hibbler, and that's another absolutely fascinating cache of material and correspondence, and they spent so much time in those regions to film White Wilderness, and I started researching obviously all of the others, and so that's one thing, which is how rich the whole making of process is and how many wonderful stories there is to tell. But the other thing in parallel, the other thing that made me look at things differently, which I sensed already before working on that project, but which I realized in even more detail, is that when we talk about Disney history, when we read about Disney history, we always read, or we often read about how something went from point A to point C or point A to point D. And what I'm really fascinated about is what happened in between? How are all of those dots connected? What happened actually from not from point A to point C, but from point A to point B? And how did that happen? And how is that connected to the rest? And what are all of the details? What's the real story? What is the richer story? Not just about those projects that made it to the screen, but and the often repeated press stories, but what really happened behind the scenes? What were all of the ideas that were discarded? What was the real interaction between the people who worked on those projects? What were the roughs they worked on, and the things that then evolved 10 years later to become something else? All of that is really fascinating, and that's what I'm trying to do with all of those book projects. I mean, right now, I'm working on another book with my friend and fellow Disney historian Jim Holyfield about the making of Walt Disney's Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and that's a movie that's released in, I believe, in 1959, if I have my dates right, and but Walt starts working on it in 1946, and in fact, I just found the roots of that project to an even earlier date. And so that's really crazy. And it takes so long for those projects to develop. And there are so many ideas that come to the mix, and so many people involved, and so many discussions, and so many great stories of exploration and adventures and trips and so on and so forth. And it's like, why haven't we told those stories before? It makes it 10 times more interesting that everything we have already read about all of this. And so that was fun. And then in parallel, there is obviously, as you know, we were talking earlier about that monograph that Ted, JB, and I wrote about Walt Disney and El Grupo in Latin America. But then when we finished writing that, I went to Ted, I went to JB, I said, guys, okay, now we know everything that happened during that 2.5 months trip to Latin America, but we both know, the three of us know that there were follow-up trips to Mexico and to Cuba. What do we know about those? What photos do we have about those and so on? And they were like, not much. A few things that we're going to share with you, but not much. And so I like, well, then we need to write the sequel. We need to write the book about the trips to Mexico and Cuba because they met so many interesting people. They saw so many interesting things. It has such influence on everything else that they did after that. We need to find out. We need to know. We need to know more about their meetings with the muralist Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and the presidents of those countries and the great caricaturist in Cuba, Conrado Massaguer, and so on. We need to know about all of that and see all of that and be with them. And we're like, okay, yeah, I think we'll do that. And then so we started doing that, and now it has evolved in what will be a book with 250 illustrations from photographs to artwork and all of it never seen before, and great stories from people who met them, who were there with their diaries, their correspondence, their photos, and so on and so forth. And so that's fascinating to me. That's really what's really exciting to just dig up so much new material, which could be like just like nitpicky details, but no, we really tell great human stories, great creative stories, great stories about what an incredibly rich environment the Disney studio was, and how much work they had to do, and how many people they had to talk to make their movies happen and to make them as wonderful as they are.
Yeah, I think it's always so amazing to hear how you go firsthand. Yes, you're getting actual manuscripts or diaries, photos, and things, and some things from the Disney archives, but you're actually connecting with people who have that firsthand knowledge. They're either actually connected to it or related to the people who were there, and that has to be bringing a much richer story for you.
There's absolutely no doubt. I mean, the whole philosophy from the start was to say, where else? Where else haven't we looked yet? Where else? Who else can we contact? Let me give you an example. Researching that trip to Cuba, for example, or those two trips to Cuba in 43 and 44, where Walt wasn't on those trips, but on the first trip was Mary Blair and Walt's brother-in-law, Bill Cottrell, and then a person who was in charge of localization of the Disney movies called Jack Cutting. Um, and I was like, okay, so this person has already spoken with the family of Mary Blair. In fact, I had been in touch with the family of Mary Blair, and so I had gotten the photographs that were there. Um, And then this person has this document from Mary Blair. So that part is really well covered. I think we've looked under every rock. And so Jim Holyfield had actually some wonderful notes from Mary Blair in his collection, which was like absolutely revelatory and just put all of the pieces together. And then, unfortunately, we know that the collection of Bill Cottrell was destroyed in a fire, so that's gone. We won't be able to find anything there. Jack Cutting, again, Jim Holyfield had most of the papers from Jack Cutting, so that was done. I was like, and I started thinking, I'm like, okay, so we probably have. I'm like, oh no, wait. There was one last person on that trip. He wasn't working for the studio, but he was working for the government and he was with them for all of the trip. And so I contacted the family of that fourth person son, and I said, well, here is why I'm contacting you and so on. Do you have any doc? They're like, yeah, we have quite a few photos and they're in color. I'm like, this is amazing. And they said, and we have correspondence where he talks about his trip to Cuba with Mary Blair and with Jack Cutting. And so they sent me copies of all of that and it tied all of the pieces together. And it just gave another dimension to the whole story. I'll give you just one more example, which is, so there was a second trip to Cuba in 1944. And I was researching and researching and researching and trying to find who they had met and so on. And at some point, they meet a very, very famous Cuban composer called Ernesto Lecuona. And so I started digging more into the life of Lecuona, the career of Lecuona, trying to find out if there were things online about his meetings with the Disney artists. And I did find a letter from him in Spanish where he describes his visit to the Disney studio a few years later to discuss the project, I think in 1946. This is great. And so then I look at who had released that letter, and the letter had been released in a book, a collection of letters by Ernesto Lecuona, by a Cuban historian. And so I researched a Cuban historian. I'm like, if I get in touch with him, maybe he has more. And so it was incredibly difficult to get in touch with that historian because he is living still today in Cuba. And communication with Cuba is not easy. And so I finally managed to send him an email through someone else. And he answers, he says, listen, emails are not working really well here, but I have a WhatsApp number. Can you contact me via WhatsApp? And so I do. And so we start talking via WhatsApp. I'm like, do you have anything else that might be related to my quest? And he says, actually, I think I do. I have one other letter, which he sent me, which had a few interesting things in there. But the document that really blew my mind, he said, Ernesto Lecuona was at some point invited to a dinner at the house of a music composer, and that music composer had been the guide of the Disney artist in Cuba for the whole trip, and so on and so forth, and the guide of Walt to Mexico during his whole trip. And so Ernesto Lecuona had been invited to a dinner from that music producer who had also invited Walt Disney to that dinner. And Lecuona had actually written an article for a local newspaper a few days after that dinner, where he described the whole dinner and his arrival at the house, which it's like he's writing a fairy tale because the house is so incredible and so on and so forth. And then describes the meeting with Walt and how Walt had asked him to play music for 2 hours, and he did that with immense pleasure. And because it was Walt, it was the first time in his life he had played so much, and so on and so forth. And the whole thing is the perfect conclusion to the last chapter of the book and the book itself. And it ends on an incredible note. But the whole article was in Spanish. I translated everything, and if I hadn't gotten in contact with that local Cuban historian, that article would never have been found. And so that was a really, really, really great moment and a very fun part of that whole project. And so there is that moment in almost every one of the projects that I've been working on, and those are the most gratifying moments, the moments where you're like, ha, I know exactly why I'm doing this.
That's that's incredible, and
Wow, yeah.
that's the kind of stuff that we're every single one of the things we've seen that you've put out has that kind of interesting stories, those kind of amazing moments that you just don't hear anyplace else. And also, what I love, and you can see it right here and hear it right here, in your passion for these projects comes across one here as we're speaking with you, but definitely in your writing as well, the storytelling that's involved in these different books. And we're so excited for all the stuff you have coming. I mean, like this is amazing. We're going to have to speak with you about those projects at a different time. But I want to take it back just a little bit more to the origins of Walt Disney's True Life Adventures one more time. You know, your passion comes across in it. And I want to know, like, what really would you be looking for the reader to take out of that? What would be the big takeaway from this monograph that you put out about these amazing stories?
Well, it depends what they are most interested in. If they love like the classic animated features from the 1930s, I would love them to learn a lot more about the making of Bambi, and they'll find that in the first chapter of that monograph. They'll find a lot more details, a lot more photos that they had never seen before about a specific part of the making of Bambi. If they're curious about little known projects, projects that are have to do with the Fab Five, Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, and their friends. They'll find a lot of information about little known projects involving all of those characters in the parts in the chapter about the educational projects from World War II. And that's going to give new dimensions to their understanding of what Walt was trying to do with those characters in those years. Um, if they are curious about really, really obscure projects, then that same chapter is going to give them a window onto those other educational projects with some really fun new characters that Walt was developing with his artists for those. And then if they want to go on adventures outside of mainland United States, if they want to discover places that they have not necessarily seen before, then the last three chapters of the book are going to really take them into just outstanding adventures in times where really adventure really meant adventure, and so and meeting in the process some absolutely fascinating artists and individuals and seeing artwork that will blow their minds. So I think those are the key takeaways that they could get from that book.
For sure. If somebody's really never heard or watched of the True Life Adventure series, what's one story in your book that is you think will really say make them feel like I have to read this or I have to know more about this?
Well, I think that it's hard to pick one specific story, but it is really um, following the Milots on their quest for the perfect image, for the perfect scene, for the perfect story that they will tell via their film, and trying to see how much hardship, how much fun adventures, how much uh, cultural discoveries and overall discoveries the Milots were making at the time, and just being there with them to make those discoveries with them without the hardship, uh, because I think we all would love to be there and explore what they have explored, but experiencing the 2 months without a bath or the freezing conditions or living in an igloo for all of that time and so on and so forth, that's maybe a little bit less appealing to quite a few of us. And so I think that is really a big part of the story. The other big thing that will really make them want to read the book is just seeing how all of the Disney artists were trying new ideas, were thinking of so many different fascinating concepts, and how Walt was shaping all of that and putting all of that into form, and finally give it the shape and the structure it has now, and how great he was at doing that, and how long it took. How not from one day to the next did it happen? How all of that was really, really, really hard work, and learning about that hard work is actually in itself a really, really, really fun story to read.
Well, I mean, it's an amazing, it's really an amazing book, and it works on so many different levels for people because one, you could use it for scholarly work. And there's so much great research, so much information involved. But also, you use things like you use actual storyboards that they were using to build some of these scenes and kind of come across some of these films. And it works as a coffee table type book too, that you can just leaf through because there's so much fantastic work that you've discovered, that you've photographed, that you've put in this book as well. You've got to find it. Again, it is the origins of Walt Disney's true life adventures. Michelle's holding it up here for those of you watching it on YouTube. You've got to find it. It is really great. If you want to check it out, you can find it on Stuart Ng Books. I believe it's also on Amazon, other places where you find books, but Stuart Ng Books is the best place to find it. And you're really going to check it out, right, Michelle?
Oh yeah, like you said, it covers so many different ways of approaching the stories behind here that you are going to love it.
Yeah, and we'll put links as well in our show notes so you can find it there as well. You've talked about a little bit about it, Didier, but before we let you go, what are the next projects you're working on? What's coming out next from Didier Ghez?
Well, hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have a new monograph, which is about Mickey Mouse in the 1930s during the Christmas season. And it's a really fun one. There will be another Mickey Mouse volume in a few years' time, which is already completely written about Mickey Mouse in the 1930s on stage and on radio, which is an incredible story that has not really been told before. I'm working on a book for Chronicle Books about backgrounds and concept art, very broad subject matter that they brought to me a few months ago. It's going to be called The Wonderful Worlds of Disney, and it's going to cover from the 1930s to the 2020s. So it's not going to go into a lot of details, but you're going to see a lot of artwork that you have not seen before, and I think it's going to be fun too. And then we talked about Walt Disney's, the making of Walt Disney's Darby O'Gill and the Little People. We talked about the sequel to Walt Disney and Grupo in Latin America, which is going to be about Mexico and Cuba. I'm starting to work with someone from the wonderful person from the Animation Research Library, Fox Carney, on a monograph about Walt Disney, Roald Dahl, and the Gremlins, which I think is going to be very fun too. And there are a few other surprises and other projects that, including one which I'm going to discuss with a friend in just a few minutes after this call.
Nice.
Wow, so many things going on for Didier again. But please check out The Origin of Walt Disney's True Life Adventures. It's a great book. You really, really want to find it. Didier, we hope you'll come on and talk to us about all those projects. We may have to have you on weekly. You've got so much going on. But we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again here on the Hyperion Adventures podcast.
Thank you to both of you. It has been an absolute pleasure, as always.